All right. So let's get into the solution to all those problems. Obviously, everybody is on this webinar. You know the solution is sustainable landscaping, reducing or eliminating your synthetic pesticide and fertilizer use. But it's easier said than done for most people. We cover a lot of different approaches about how you can eliminate synthetic pesticide use on turf grass fields as well as natural areas. And there are a number of steps. And we're seeing it's be a challenge for companies, municipalities, park districts, and school districts to follow our approach. So that's one of the reasons why we came up with our standards, is because we wanted to help park districts, school districts, municipalities, and companies follow and implement the approaches and then be recognized for it. The other reason we came up with these standards is because there's a rising demand out there from customers, residents for less toxic spaces, less input spaces, and less applications of synthetic pesticides and fertilizers. But we're not meeting that demand right now. There's a lot of confusion around there. You can see a lot of marketing ploys that say we have sustainable landscaping, or they use organic lawn care, natural lawn care, IPM, organic based. I came up with the word cloud of all the different types of terms that we hear in the U.S. lawn and garden sector, and there's not really one thing that can say this is sustainable landscaping. And so that confuses customers, that confuses residents, and we want to help them identify and define what an actual sustainable landscaping service is, or what a landscape is that is managed sustainably. And so that's why we decided to work with Green Shield Certified. Now, Green Shield Certified, it helps that the IPM Institute, my employer, has managed Green Shield Certifieds for 20 years now. So that obviously helps. But we also like the two aspects of Green Shield Certified. So first, let me just define Green Shield Certified. The mission of GSC for short is to increase demand for sustainable pest and weed control services by certifying pest management providers, facilities, and landscapes that pose limited health risks to humans and the environment. Right now, we have two GSC programs, GSC for pest management professionals and GSC for facilities. Both are heavily focused on indoor pest control. So we haven't really done an outdoor pest control certification, hence the GSC for landscapes. But what we like about GSC is two things. First, it's recognized nationally by a lot of other nonprofits, as well as other certification programs. So for example, we work with the Natural Resources Defense Council to get it recognized by a lot of sustainability standards and a lot of other individuals when we introduce GSC. Right now, USGBC's LEED certification recognizes, which is for sustainable buildings, it recognizes GSC for their IPM credits. So if you are GSC certified, or if you have a GSC certified provider, then you get those IPM credits for LEED. Another certification that just started recognizing us is WELL, which is a Healthy Building Standards. And they have it for their IPM as well as indoor air quality credits that can be considered if you are GSC certified. GRESB, which is an environmental, social, and governance quantification standard. They also recognize us, and that's for real estate firms, and a number of other green or sustainable standards recognize GSC outside of those three. So that's the first reason why we wanted to come up with a program under GSC for sustainable landscaping. The second reason that we wanted to do it is we really like the process that GSC implements. GSC was started by Dr. Thomas Green, who is also the founder of the IPM Institute, and he really values the on-site evaluation. So Dr. Thomas Green is one of our evaluators that we have for GSC for pest management professionals and GSC for facilities. What the on-site evaluation, we require an on-site evaluation every 3 years. And so the evaluator, for about a day, visits the company headquarters or the facility that we're evaluating. He interviews the manager or the owner of the company about their sustainability practices, about their, all different business practices. He does a site visit of a client. He shadows a client visit, and then he looks at all the equipment that you use for pesticide application, fertilizer application, how you're storing all these products and everything like that. And through this on-site evaluation, he's going through a guide and evaluation that is provided for each of these programs. So GSC for pest management professionals and GSC for facilities has a guide and evaluation. GSC for landscapes also has a guide and evaluation, which Leah has shared over the chat. And on that guide and evaluation, he's going through each point. So there are a set of minimum requirements that all applicants need to achieve if they're going to receive GSC recognition. And then there are scored practices where the applicant needs to score 80% or above to receive GSC recognition. So that's what the evaluator is he's going through that report. And if you see on the PDF document, there is room for the evaluator to take notes on each of the sections. And for those notes, he'll take notes, whether you are achieve those minimum requirements, where room for improvement. And at the end, there are some recommendations for the company or for the facility to implement. So he does the on-site evaluation. Then a month later, he provides an interim report that says whether or not you have reached or achieved our standards. If you have achieved the standards, that's great. There's still going to be recommendations no matter what to improve your sustainable pest control, but you will receive the GSC recognition. If you didn't achieve the standards, we give you a year to work on the recommendations that are in that report. And then if you address them within that year, then you will receive your Green Shield certified recognition. So we are applying that same process to GSC for landscapes. We have that guide and evaluation, and the people that are eligible for certification include landscape management providers. So this includes landscape designers, landscape installers, as well as landscape architects and just management. So this could be lawn care management, but also natural area management that qualify for our certification. And then we're able to also certify green spaces like soccer and football fields, parks, natural areas, corporate and educational campuses. So a wide variety of landscapes and services we are able to certify through GSC for landscapes. And just another reason of why we wanted to pursue or come up with GSC for landscapes is because the results from GSC for pest management professionals and GSC for facilities. We have really seen improvement in our current clients. So before the evaluation that we did for our current companies, only about 21 of the companies avoided products with the labels of danger or warning, but those products are not acceptable under GSC. So all 47 of our clients now completely avoid those products with the warning label of danger or warning. And it's similar for all these other health effects. You can see only 6 companies avoided products completely that were carcinogenic. But after our standards and after our evaluation, all 47 companies do not have any products that are carcinogenic. So really great results in terms of reducing human health risk. Of course, in indoors, our focus is on human health risk. For outdoors, it's human health risk, but also the environment because of water quality and pollinator health. So looking a little bit more in depth at our GSC for landscapes, there are differences between GSC for landscapes and GSC for pest management professionals and GSC for facilities. First, in terms of the total minimum requirements and scored practices. So we I counted there are 63 minimum requirements that you can earn in total. You don't have to meet all 63 minimum requirements. I'll talk about that a little bit later because you can go for design, installation, and or maintenance. So I'll talk about that in the next slide. And then there are 52 total scored practices for a total of 102 scored points. And so how we do scoring on those scored practices is on a scale of 0 to 2. 0 is unsatisfactory, 1 is satisfactory, and 2 is exceptional. And so you'll notice that we require you to do above 80%. So what we want all of our clients to do is to go above and beyond our standards with exceptional. So we don't want you to just be satisfactory. We want you to be exceptional because our slogan is the sustainable standard for premium pest protection, not just the sustainable standard for pest protection. And then there are about 11 bonus practices for a total of 22 points. So those bonus practices, you can only add to your score. You can't delete on the score. Also unique to GSC for landscapes is we have an organic distinction. This is because we have a lot of companies that want to separate their organic services from regular IPM or regular sustainable landscaping. They still need to meet all the minimum requirements and score 80% or above on the scored practices. But then on page 29, I believe they need to meet all the minimum requirements on I think it's page 29, where we have the OMRI criteria. So all their products need to satisfy the OMRI criteria to get that organic distinction. That doesn't mean that the products need to be OMRI listed or even OMRI certified. It just means that it needs to meet those criteria, because we know there's some products that just don't go through the OMRI certification process, but are still organic to their core. So that's for that organic distinction. So you'd get the GSC for landscapes organic distinction as opposed to just the GSC for landscapes. And then finally, to mention is you can either certify your entire company or just a service. And a lot of our companies just pursue GSC for a service, not their entire company, but there is the option for both if you so choose. And it's a similar thing if you're a park district, municipality, or school district. You can certify all your green spaces, or you can just certify a couple green spaces based on our evaluation. Final thing to mention about GSC before I go into how you can actually achieve GSC and the practices that align with GSC for landscapes is there are 4 sections for GSC for landscapes that you'll notice. First is all services, and then second is design, third is installation, fourth is maintenance. So all companies need to satisfy the minimum requirements and scored practices in the all services section. Then you can pursue 1, 2, or 3 of the design, installation, or maintenance sections. So if you're just a design or landscape architecture firm, you can still achieve GSC by just pursuing the design and installation minimum requirements and scored practices, and you don't have to go through the maintenance minimum requirements and scored practices. We'll just remove that from the guide and evaluation, or from that on-site evaluation. If you're a lawn care company that strictly manages grass organically or sustainably, you can just pursue the maintenance portion of the minimum requirements and scored practices. You don't need to go for the design and installation requirements. So looking at all 4 sections, all services has about 19 minimum requirements, 12 scored practices, and 1 bonus practice. And all services, I'll say, is very related to, do you have an IPM policy? Do you have a sustainable landscaping policy or plan? Do you train your staff in IPM and sustainable landscaping? Kind of business practices is what's really focused on for all services. Design is really about selecting the right plant for the right place. And that's the same for installation too. And you have about 7 minimum requirements, 17 scored practices, and 5 bonus practices. Installation, you have 8 minimum requirements and 4 scored practices. Maintenance, we have 29 minimum requirements and 20 scored practices and 8 bonus practices. It's fitting because we are the Integrated Pest Management Institute. So maintenance being our largest section is kind of fitting and on brand for us. But I think you'll find that there's a lot of content in the design and installation sections of GSE for landscapes too. Now, if you're looking at these 63 minimum requirements and 102 total scored points and thinking seems a little bit overwhelming and kind of rigorous, I want to help you as much as I can. And so I'm going to share some approaches or an approach that if you implement or follow that approach, I'm pretty confident that your company, your municipality, your park district, or your school district can achieve our GSE for landscape standards. And I'm going to share that approach, which is called the flywheel weed management approach. Leah is going to put links to lawnandland.org and the flywheel weed management approach. The link is bit.ly/flywheel approach. And we have a lot of different case studies of people implementing aspects of this flywheel weed management approach. And we have the first presentation about the flywheel from Nick Fuller, who's from Natural Communities, LLC, of the Northwest suburbs of Chicago. They're a native plant distributor. And in his presentation, he talks about trying to come up with viable and safe alternatives to glyphosate on natural areas, mainly natural areas, because that's his expertise. And he says there's not a one-to-one replacement of a product for glyphosate, because glyphosate is designed to kill weeds and kill it well. But if you follow our flywheel weed management approach over time, you should be able to significantly limit or completely eliminate your need to use for glyphosate. And so the concept of the flywheel is in the industrial ages, they had these large metal wheels that were generators, and it took a lot of effort at the beginning to push it forward, right? It takes a lot of effort to push it forward, but once it gets this momentum going, it's very hard to stop. That's what we want for our landscapes. We want to spend a lot of time and resources in these 4 spokes that you see on the wheel of investigation, plan and prevention, plant and seed selection, alternative weed control products and practices, and evaluation improvement. We want to spend a lot of time and resources on those 4 spokes in the first few years to manage our vegetation. And eventually our vegetation will develop resilience and self-sufficiency that on its own, it will outcompete weeds and pests for air, water, sunlight, and nutrients. And so you won't need many, if any, products to manage the landscape after you follow all 4 of these spokes. And why I like this flywheel weed management approach is I do think it aligns really well with our GSE for landscape standards, because spoke 1 and 2, for example, really aligns with our design and installation sections. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit. And then spokes 3 and 4 align really well with our maintenance section. So starting off with that design and installation and spokes 1 to 2 of our flywheel, the very first spoke is investigation, plan, and prevention. And from my opinion, this is kind of the most important part of any management, of any sustainable landscape management project or program, because you are assessing you're determining the hydrological conditions, soil conditions, and weather conditions or climate conditions, so that you can choose the right plant for the right place, and also determine the management practices needed to grow that specific plant that you want to nurture. And so for all of Midwest Grows Green's work, we do significant site assessment, and we ask questions of what's the climate? How much sunlight does the landscape receive? How much rain? What vegetation are you starting off with? Native, non-native, or invasive? What type of vegetation used to inhabit the site? are there any remnant ecosystems? Remnant ecosystems means if there's any plants on the site that were on the site probably 100 years back from the native landscapes. What type of soil? Clay, sand, loam, and how well does that soil drain? So all these questions, if you are able to answer them, you should come up with a good plan for what type of landscape you want to manage and management schedule for that landscape. I'll take you through an example from Midwest Grows Green's perspective of how we use these questions. So we have a program called our Technical Assistance Program, or TAP for short, that helps park districts, school districts, and municipalities transition their highly trafficked sports and recreational fields or just green spaces away from synthetic pesticides and fertilizers. One of the communities was Elgin, Illinois, which is a northwest Chicago suburb. And they gave us a 3-acre section that you can see in the aerial in the image to the left of turf grass. And they told us that they want to continue to grow turf grass on this area. So we already know what type of plant we want to grow. What we need to do is we need to assess the environmental conditions, the soil conditions, the hydrological conditions to see how best we can grow grass on this site. So to do that investigation, we brought soil scientist Justinas Vitas Papadinskis from Save Our Soil LLC to the site to look at the soil compaction, look at the weed pressure, the turf grass density, and takes soil samples and soil tests. And so he mapped out the area with a blue circle for the basin and then red circles for the slopes on the east and west side. And on the basin, what you can see is there are some black spots. That is basically standing water that you can see in the image to the upper right. That's standing water year round. And that's significant concern. It gives off noxious smells. It can be unsightly. It can be a breeding ground for mosquitoes, but it can also waterlog the roots of the turf grass. So we want to address that standing water. We want to reduce that standing water. And to address it, we looked around and we looked at the east and west slope, and you can see a lot of brown. And in the images to the bottom right, you can see that brown is gravel, compacted soil, not much grass. There might be some weeds in there, but really that's an indication to us that we're dealing with very compacted soil because grass isn't growing there, but weeds really aren't growing there either. So our hypothesis is that rainfall is going on these east and west slopes. It's not infiltrating the soil and it's running off into our basin. And the water continues to conglomerate from there. So what we want to do is we want to capture rainfall on the east and west slopes, grow grass on the east and west slopes, and then reduce the standing water in the basin. So we do a couple of further assessments just to confirm our hypothesis. This is a soil penetrometer or soil compaction reading. So we have a soil penetrometer, which on the device's tip measures the resistance of the soil in pounds per square inch, or PSI. So once the PSI reaches about 300 PSI, that indicates to us that we are dealing with heavily compacted soil and root limiting conditions. So as you can see on the basin, the graph to the left, the penetrometer went about 21 inches deep before it hit that 300 PSI level. Not really that surprising because it's just saturated with water, so we could drive that device really deep in the soil without much resistance. But on the east and west slope areas, the bare soil areas, we could only really reach 3 inches before we hit 300 PSI. So we are dealing with compacted soil. So that's a great indication for it. The other thing that confirmed our hypothesis was the results from the soil test. In this graph, the light brown means you're deficient in the nutrients. The dark brown means you're very deficient in those nutrients. And in fact, what we found is that the east and west slopes tended to have lower nutrient levels compared to the basin. So that is once again confirming that the rainfall is going on the slopes and is bringing all the nutrients from the slopes into the basin. So our decision was to grow grass on those slopes was to first off rake off all that gravel, and then rake up that gravel and then apply some compost top dressing to capture the rainwater on the slopes, and then oversee that compost top dressing with grass seed. You can see the grass seeds start to sprout up about a week after the top dressing. And then about a month into it, we have a fully established turf grass, and kids are playing on that soccer field about a month and a half in. We are very happy with the results, but it's because of all our planning, our investigation work, as well as our soil testing, that we are able to grow grass with no synthetic pesticides nor fertilizers on this plot. So moving now on to spoke number 2, which is plant and seed selection. You'll really help with that if you invest a lot of time on your first spoke. But when we're selecting plants and seeds, we want to make sure that they are low input first, diverse mixes, competitive, especially if you are trying to transition away from invasive weed plot, and you want to avoid aggressive non-native species that could become invasive. So let's start with low input plants. Now, the most low input plant is native plants, of course, and we would recommend in GSE for landscapes to apply native landscapes native plants whenever possible. But we do understand that there are some cases where your client or your community doesn't want prairies because it can be unsightly or anything like that. Fortunately, there are options to go low input and low mow, or have these low mow varieties. Turf grass varieties continue to get more sustainable, but as I mentioned, we have the eco lawns companies like ProTime Lawn Seed that is using microclover and to reduce the inputs as well as the maintenance. You can see an image of their staple mix, which is called Fleur de Lawn, and includes the clover, the fescues, and a couple wildflowers like sweet alyssum, English daisy, and strawberry clover. So this is actually a habitat or forage for pollinators, and you don't need to use any pesticides on this landscape. But they have 11 or so other varieties. One variety includes the rough and ready mix, which is fescue and just tall fescue, and that's very wear tolerant. It's also very shade tolerant. And then we have an image of the dog park eco lawn to the right, which also is very wear tolerant, but can handle a lot of salt. So it can handle pet urine pretty well. So that's a consideration if native plants isn't an option for your current client or your community for plant and seed selection. Another one for plant and seed selection is you want to make sure you have diverse mixes. I know sometimes that's not possible, but in GSE for landscapes, we have a clause that you should have at least 10 species per 10,000 square feet. That's actually kind of a low at the low end. So that would just be satisfactory if you have 10 species per 10,000 square feet. As you can see in the graph to the left, those mixes have 40 to 39 species. This graph was created by Nick Fuller from Natural Communities LLC. And it was to really emphasize the importance of that spoke 1, that investigation planning, because he has 2 different mixes. The wet prairie native seed mix is what he calls a community specific mix. And then the one on the right, the detention basin, rain garden, and bioswale native seed mix is more of a broad spectrum mix. So if you're doing your assessment and you determine that your site is a wet prairie environment or soil ecosystem, then you're going to be best served by applying that wet prairie native seed mix. A lot of those flowers, a lot of those native grasses, a lot of those sedge and rush species will germinate, and you will have a kind of well-established prairie. But if you misdetermine, if you are wrong, that it's not a wet prairie, or you just don't know, and it turns out the environment is not a wet prairie environment, and you plant this wet prairie native seed mix, that mix is not going to germinate as well, and it's not going to establish as well, and you're going to be ending up applying more herbicides over time to maintain that prairie. Now, there are options if you don't have that much information, and that's the options would be the more broad spectrum, the detention basin, rain garden, bioswale native seed mix, which can work in more environments, more wetland environments, but it just won't germinate as effectively as the wet prairie native seed mix if in a wet prairie environment. So that's just to consider why you should do all this investigation and planning beforehand. Now, for some environments, it's going to be very challenging to get your prairie looking like the image to the right, especially if that environment is infested with a lot of invasive species like Phragmites or anything like that, that requires a lot of control because the soil is going to contain a lot of weed seeds in it, and it's going to continue to try to sprout up. And for those environments, once you do control the invasive weeds, it's important to try to get some competitive native plant seeds, native plants that can outcompete those invasive weed seeds for the area. They might not be as pretty, but you can do a succession plan of these competitive plants until you finally get to that more pretty prairie that we want for our landscapes. So Nick Fuller has a list of warrior plants at bit.ly/wet prairie warriors. He also has warrior plants for other environments. One example is this great burreed. So these are plants to consider for if you're doing a kind of native restoration and transitioning away from an invasive weed site. One thing though that we want to make sure is that we avoid aggressive non-natives. Green Shield Certified for Landscapes does not allow you to have any invasive or aggressive native or really aggressive native plants too in your inventory. And so we monitor the Midwest invasive plant list and some other invasive plant lists to make sure that any seed mixes you're using don't have the potential to become invasive in our green spaces. Okay, so that is folks 1 and 2, design and installation, and then planning prevention and plant and seed selection. Now I'm going to move on to the maintenance portion, which is IPM Institute's specialty. And just a refresher of how we view IPM or how we should be managing our landscapes. We really should be stressing the cultural practices first. That's things like overseeding, watering properly, aerating compacted soil. Then biological and mechanical control can be considered. And we only want to use pesticides as a last resort. And if we're selecting pesticides, we want to use the least amount of the least harmful product. So GSC for landscapes and our maintenance section is very aligned with this graphic that you see. Most of the points, you can earn most of the points through your cultural practices. Next most frequent is through the biological and mechanical, and then the least amount is the pesticides. Really, we just have for pesticides minimum requirements. You can't apply a product that is carcinogenic. You can't apply a product with a half-life above 30 years and stuff like that. So we're stressing those other practices before we get to actual pesticide control in GSC for landscapes. I'm going to talk about maintenance for sports and recreational field, turfgrass field management, and then I'll talk about natural area management maintenance. So I do a lot of presentations about turfgrass management, and I always say that we should be managing our turfgrass like how we should be managing our bodies. We can control 2 things the most for our bodies, our diet and our exercise. We can also control the diet and the exercise of our turfgrass ecosystems the most too. For the diet, it's about understanding our plant and soil needs, and then feeding our soil with organic matter dense materials like organic fertilizers, compost top dressing, leaf mulch, and grass clippings. For exercise, it's about culturally maintaining a healthy, dense grass system that is going to outcompete weeds and pests for air, water, and sunlight. So starting with that diet and understand your soil, we already talked about investigation, planning, site assessment, but soil testing is very crucial in understanding our soil, what's going on. We require soil tests for any fertilizer application. For turf grass in GSC for landscapes, the soil test tells you the pH, the nutrient level, the organic matter content, as well as the soil consistency, and then it'll often make a recommendation for how to care for the lawn and garden. And when you get that recommendation, it's important to know that there are 16 essential nutrients for healthy soil and healthy plant life. Synthetic fertilizers often only focus on 3 of these nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Meanwhile, organic fertilizers not only provide more of these nutrients, but release these nutrients over an extended period of time so that they stay in your soil longer. And then organic fertilizers tend to have a little bit more organic matter and tend to be slow release compared to synthetic fertilizers. And so we are very concerned about water quality with our GSC for landscape standards, and organic fertilizers tend to not run off as much as synthetic fertilizers. And so that's why we recommend organic fertilizers over synthetic. Now, if you are applying synthetic fertilizers, there is a chance that you can still achieve our GSC standards. It's just going to be a lot more challenging, and you're going to have to score high in these other practices that we're talking about today. So we recommend organic fertilizers over synthetic fertilizers. And if you are using organic, you will have a better chance of meeting our standards than if you're using synthetic. Of course, if you're going for organic, GSC for organic, you can only use organic fertilizers. On lawnandland.org, we have a graphic of some popular organic fertilizers that you can look through, of alfalfa meal, seaweed, blood meal, bone meal, the nutrients they provide, and how to apply and when to apply these products. So that's a really good resource for organic fertilization if you're new to that concept. One thing I do want to mention, if it's a fertilizer, organic or synthetic, it still tends to be focused on the nutrients. And of course, nutrients are crucial for all life. But when we talk about soil, we also have soil structure. And for soil structure for grass, what we want is a sponge-like soil structure. I say sponge because we want that soil to retain water. But if you squeeze that sponge, it's going to let that water go. That's what we want with our soil too. We want it to retain air, water, and nutrients, but we don't want it to hold it on so tightly that it's suffocating our turf grass roots or the microbiology that is in the soil. And the best way to get that sponge-like soil structure is through adding organic matter, through leaf mulch, recycling your grass clippings, or applying compost top dressing. So on lawnland.org, we have a lot of resources about compost top dressing. We also have a fact sheet on midwestgrowsgreen.org about using compost on lawns and gardens. Highly recommend. We worked with the Illinois Food Scrap Coalition on that resource. All right, now looking at fitness of the lawn and cultural practices. Whenever I talk about fitness or exercise, I like to show this graphic. It's called the Read Your Weeds table. In the left column are popular weeds within your lawn of annual bluegrass, clover, crabgrass, and dandelions. On the top row are their favorable conditions: compacted soil, mowing height too low, low pH. And what most people can glean from this graphic is that if you culturally maintain healthy soil and healthy grass, you will eliminate many of these favorable conditions. So let me take you through an example. Look at annual bluegrass. Its 3 favorable conditions are compacted soil, mowing height too low, and excessive watering. All 3 can be managed culturally. First, compost top dressing is a great way to reduce compaction. But we also talk about aeration in our GSC for landscape standards. You should aerate for turf grass at least in the fall, right before an overseed, so that you can get proper seed to soil contact. If you're dealing with a sports and recreational field, you might benefit from as many as 5 aerations per year because that's getting so much foot traffic. So we do talk about aeration in our GSC for landscape standards. We also talk about mowing height in our GSC for landscape standards. And we have two different guidelines. If you are dealing with this athletic field, you want to mow no lower than 2.5 inches. But if you're dealing with a home lawn, you want to mow no lower than 3 inches. And we actually, exceptional would be around 4 inches. Mowing high helps in 2 ways. First, if you have a tall canopy, it's going to shade out the soil, and it's going to prevent weed seeds from getting access to sunlight and germinating. Second, there's a rule of a third. You never want to take off a third of a grass plant at a time. So if you're mowing high, so let's say if you're mowing at 2 inches, you only have about 1 inch of growth before you have to mow it again. If you're mowing at 4 inches, you have 2 inches of growth before you have to mow again. So there's less frequent, that allows for less frequent mowing. And finally, we have recommendations for excessive watering. We recommend watering no more than 1 inch per week, and that should be one thorough watering. We want to conserve as much water as possible in GSC for landscapes. And so we have some water conservation tips and scored practices related. Excuse me. All right, now moving to natural area management, which has differences to turf grass management. And I'm going to actually take everybody to lawnandland.org and the third flywheel spoke. But before I take everybody to that website, I just want to mention we go through a lot of different alternatives to glyphosate. And if you're pursuing alternatives to glyphosate, don't just choose one of these alternatives. You should try to use a combination of these alternatives. And it's a similar concept to how you should not be so reliant on glyphosate to control for every invasive weed, because weeds are biological organisms and they're able to develop resistance or resilience and pass that resistance on to future generations. So if you're only applying glyphosate, eventually that weed can develop resistance to that management tool and pass it on to its progeny. And then you're going to have really serious problems managing that weed in the future because of the resistance. It's a similar concept that if you're only applying, goats or targeted grazing and not any of these other management practices, the weeds are going to eventually win out if you're not using a combination of these practices. So this is what the web page looks like for alternative invasive weed management products and structures to glyphosate. You can see we link to a lot of educational resources on that website to read more about these practices. We also have interviews and presentations from experts about some of these concepts that are presented. And we have graphics and visuals of that work. So one of the first things is just to reduce weed seed presence. If you have a bare soil, if you're fortunate to be working on a bare soil area, a really good management technique is called pre-irrigation. So you irrigate that soil, let the weeds kind of sprout up for about 14 days, and then you can kill those weeds with, shallow cultivation, heat treatment, or an organic herbicide, and then plant that site with desirable vegetation. And this practice can control up to 50% of the weeds on site. So that's something that could work well. Targeted grazing is becoming more and more popular using goats because goats eat almost any vegetation. Manual removal is also considered. And you can see we have a case study that I'll refer back to in just a little bit. There's been a lot of innovation in terms of heat treatment, in flaming, steaming, and foaming. I wouldn't recommend flaming because flaming gives off propane, which is a known carcinogen by California's Proposition 65. But steaming and foaming, there's been some really cool equipment. So it's basically at 205 to 218 degrees. almost all vegetation will die, especially leafy weeds. So steaming equipment is more precise using of the heat treatment, but it's a little bit slower because foaming traps that heat. So it stays at that 205 to 218 a little bit longer. And so you can move the equipment just a little bit faster, but it's just not as precise as steaming. So whichever is your preference for that. And we have a case study of using foaming from Weeding Tech, Thomas Hamilton, that creates the foaming machine. Mulching, wood chips, compost, leaf litter, pine needles, or gravel. If you remember, I presented that Elgin work. That was a great example of us using mulching, using the compost over, and then establishing grass. And I was seeing that site, saw the site on Tuesday, and I didn't see a single dandelion in sight. So it worked pretty well without having to use any herbicides. We're very happy with those results. Solarization, oculation is once again using heat treatment, applying a tarp over. It just takes a little bit longer than the foaming or steaming because it'll take about 2 to 3 weeks to kill all the vegetation. And then organic herbicides, we have a good case study from Maggie Ryder, the assistant extension professor from the University of Minnesota, who talks about all the different organic herbicides. But just going once again on those herbicides and everything like that, it's a combination. And we have a really good case study from Sean Sin from Semper Fi Land Incorporated, where he shows his invasive species control. And as you can see, for annual invasive species, he uses a combination of conservation mowing, selective mowing, cutting, and hand pulling. It's never just one thing. And he even uses it for a combination for perennial invasive species of a selective herbicide application, but also prescribed burn management too. So it's never just one thing to control these weeds in natural areas. Now, if weed persists, and if you decide that your only option is pesticides, you can still achieve our GSC for landscape standards. You just need to meet our pesticide product selection protocol. I forgot what page it was on the guide and evaluation, but I know that it's minimum requirements. So your product needs to meet all these requirements that you see on this slide. First, you need to avoid products with high acute toxicity. So that means an EPA label of danger or warning. So you want a caution or reduced risk product. You want to avoid products that have possible, probable, known, or likely carcinogens, reproductive toxicants, endocrine disruptors, or nervous system toxicity. So to evaluate that, we look at the EPA, but we also look at international associations like the International Association for the Research on Cancer and California, the 65 list. We want to avoid products where the soil half-life of all ingredients lasts longer than 30 days. You want to train staff for application, storage, and disposal of lawn care products. And you want to designate an IPM coordinator to determine necessary actions for a pest or weed problem. In our standards, I believe we share lists of reduced risk as well as organic products that are eligible for GSC for landscape standards. And as I mentioned before, glyphosate in some cases will be eligible, but you need to prove that glyphosate is your only option based on all the protocols, minimum requirements that you see on GSC for landscapes. All right, moving on to the final spoke of our flywheel. And I think something that's often overlooked, but a strength of GSC, because we have that 3-year evaluation and we also have an annual renewal for companies, is evaluation improvement. We want to make sure that we're continuing to improve our sustainable landscaping services and programs. And there's a lot of things that you can do to ensure continual improvement evaluation. One thing we like to do at Midwest Grows Green is we like to have a rubric to evaluate how our landscapes are performing. This is an example of a sports turf rating system rubric. It was created by the Ohio State University, and we use it for our technical assistance program. It looks at different conditions on the field. Like you can see on the left, the light, how much shade, is it full sun, is it deep shade? What's the weed pressure? How many times are you fertilizing? And as you can see, you rate it on subjectively on a scale of 1 to 3 or 1 to 5. 1 for light would be full sun, 3 would be deep shade. And so you want as low of a score as possible on this rubric. So if you have a score between 11 and 20, that means you should continue management throughout. You really shouldn't change much. But if you have 21 to 35, then you're really going to want to reconsider some of your management practices and change them up. And then if it's over 35, that's really concerning. And you might need to do a complete new restoration project. So that's just keeping track of the progress of your field or green space and making sure the management is effective. You know, another thing that GSE for Landscapes does, I mentioned that we go through your inventory, we look through a lot of your records. Companies, park districts, school districts, and municipalities that take really good records are going to have a head up in achieving our standards. You see an example of a really good pesticide application data sheet from the Skokie Park District. It tells you the application date, the product applied, the reason for application. It even goes as specific as what was the wind velocity and direction and what was the temperature. I think this is exceptional. I think it's exceptional for pesticides. It's also exceptional for fertilizer applications. And if you're not doing this, and you don't have to do it for GSE, another good consideration is there's the Freedom of Information Act, right? And sometimes if you're a park district or school district or even a company and a community member wants to know all the products that you're applying and why, they can fill out a Freedom of Information Act. And if you don't have that information on file, you're going to waste a lot of time coming up with that documentation and everything like that. So it's always good to have these types of records for a Freedom of Information Act, as well as just in the next step, which is actually doing evaluations. If you have this data, that will help with your evaluations significantly. Our evaluations for GSC and Midwest Grows Green, we ask, has the health of the landscape improved? Have the long-term IPM methods been successful? What treatments were cost effective, which weren't? And have you realized the savings from reduced pesticide use and needs? We recommend doing evaluation every year. Obviously, GSC does an evaluation every 3 years, but we also have an annual renewal for companies, which goes through the products that you're applying, as well as whether or not you've been doing training. So that's every year. So we do a mini evaluation for everybody for GSC for Landscapes. So just to recap, the flywheel weed management approach, if you're following it, should give you a head up in achieving our Green Shield Certified for Landscape standards. And the 4 spokes are investigation, planning, and prevention, plant and seed selection, alternative weed control products and practices, evaluation, and improvement. A recap of what Green Shield Certified for Landscapes is. We just introduced these standards this week, and this is our first full presentation of going through it. You're eligible for certification if you are a landscape architect, designer, installer, manager, or maintenance, or a natural resource manager. Or you can certify your green spaces as soccer and football fields, parks, natural areas, corporate and educational campuses. If you are interested in the certification process, there's 6 steps. The first is to schedule that on-site evaluation that I talked about. It will be with either myself, if it's about regarding turf grass, and then we also are going to contract out for native planting and natural area certification. And then about a month after, we'll give you the interim report from that on-site evaluation. If you pass it, you will receive the GSC recognition from there. But we still will have recommendations to improve your sustainable pest control. If you don't pass it, then we give you a full year to pass our standards. meet all the minimum requirements, score 80% or above on those scored practices. And then if you address all of our recommendations, you will receive that GSC recognition. Once you receive that recognition, we do a lot of marketing to recognize you. We'll do a press release for your company or your landscape and go to local news outlets about the marketing about your new recognition. We'll do social media posts and so on. There's an annual renewal process. If you're a company, you don't have to do it if you're just certifying a landscape. So if you're just certifying a green space, all you have to do is the evaluation process. If you're certifying your company, we want to make sure that you're continuing to adhere to our standards and to adhere to our standards by let us know what products you're using for the Green Shield certified service or for your company, and if you're continuing to train your staff in sustainable landscaping. So that's associated with the annual renewal form. And then everybody has to get reevaluated every 3 years so that we know that you're adhering to our standards and that we can help you go above and beyond and continue to improve your sustainable landscaping service. So if you are interested in getting started for certified, please email me, Ryan Anderson at randerson@ipminstitute.org to schedule your on-site evaluation. This is more contact information from me. By attending this session, you qualify for $125 off of our on-site evaluation, which is about the initial on-site evaluation is $1,250 plus travel. That is it for my presentation.